Hey, thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you to talk about this project of government competitiveness rankings or scores. Tonight we'll be focusing on the OECD countries for 2016, but the methodology particularly that we'll talk about at the beginning of the presentation is applicable to developing countries as well. So just as an overview of where we will go this evening, we'll talk a little bit about that theory and methodology of how the rankings were developed and implemented. And then we'll be talking about an overview of some of the context and the correlates of what we think is happening alongside of these rankings. And then we'll present the rankings themselves and provide a few illustrations of 7 countries. So let's begin with a definition of government competitiveness. So the power of government to, in light of various constraints, take resources from in and outside of the country and improve social, economic, and cultural conditions of the nation in order to sustainably enhance citizens' quality of life. And I think it's important to spend just a few seconds on the definition. I'll come back to this definition in the next slide and show how this is linked to some of the stages. There's a systems model that's used and how this is related to each of those points in the systems model. So what's new and important in the government competitiveness method relative to other rankings that are out there of different nations and countries? I think one of the first things to look to with the government competitiveness ranking is that it's more balanced than current approaches, which are largely market heavy, looking heavily at economic indicators. The other thing that's really important to narrow in on and to underscore, I suppose, in this area is that there's a systems model or theory that underlies the logic of this ranking system. And the theory begins with inputs. And focuses heavily on throughputs, which is something that's missing from a lot of the other extant rankings or scores, which focus heavily on outputs and even confound the outputs and inputs in many areas. And then the government competitiveness ranking is also very valuable in that it spends a good portion of attention on outcomes. So let me tie this back into the definition. So inputs, back to this definition that I talked about earlier, inputs involve the constraints and the resources that are inside and outside of the country. The throughputs really focus on the power of the government, so it focuses on institutional capacity, something sadly that's been missing from some of the other rankings and indices used. Outputs focuses on the social, economic, and cultural conditions and the improvement of those, ultimately for outcomes that really matter, the sustainable enhancement of quality of life for citizens. One other thing to highlight about this approach is it facilitates a policy-specific focus. And we'll talk about multiple policy areas throughout the presentation, but it allows one to look at a country's general well-being and ranking relative to others, but also specific policy areas. Why is this important? Multiple reasons, but it's certainly something that's being called for from some of the leading scholars, that people that are trained in and appreciate, in particular, public administration and have studied public service institutions are saying public administrators need to be involved in rankings and scorings so that we can add that our own unique perspective, the perspective that particularly draws on that institutional capacity or the throughputs that we talked about a little earlier. And so here's just an anecdote taken from a recent issue of PAR where the editor, Jim Perry, is calling for us to become more involved in the rankings business. So this is a very valuable illustration of the logic model that we talked about earlier. And you can see that it's a recursive model. So we begin with the inputs, the throughputs, the outputs, the outcomes, and then there's a feedback loop, which is really valuable because we understand that these are dynamic processes. These are the policy areas that I mentioned earlier, and it's a nice balanced realm of policy areas. Each one, of course, can be narrowed and focused in on the inputs, the throughputs, and so forth that are involved in each of the policy stages. So it's a nice general barometer across a variety of areas of how a particular country is doing, from environmental to disaster management, agricultural, and so on. So before presenting the results from 2016, it's valuable to pause for a minute and take note of some contextual themes that are important. The first is the continuing economic uncertainty. As countries continue to struggle with or recover from a recession. The second would be social and political crises that continue to plague many countries, and in particular the focus on some of the refugee movements within and between European countries that are related to or lead to internal and intergovernmental conflict, protectionist policies. For example, the most recent example that comes to mind is Brexit. And so, as we narrow down on the first contextual factor that we referenced earlier, you can see many countries here have persistent or unresolved financial crises. And quite a few countries have financial liabilities that are in some way, shape, or form threatening some of the stability of these countries, struggling with public debt, and so on. So these certainly were part of defining the picture of how countries are doing from a ranking point of view. The next thing that I mentioned, of course, is the social and political crisis that deals with citizens seeking asylum, citizens that become refugees in neighboring countries, and multiple factors can be examined as the source of this unrest, but civil war in Syria, North African unrest or instability. And so for the European Union, what this has meant is some exogenous shocks that happen in terms of governance and social welfare, certainly impact those policy areas in particular. Related to this, of course, has been some of the protectionist policies and conflict that happens between neighboring states as they debate how to handle migrant movement, how to handle some of the unskilled labor that is coming either welcomed or unwelcomed across borders. And so we can see this chart in your lower right-hand corner that gives us a nice snapshot of the unemployment rate by place of birth for the European Union in general in the first three columns, and then some of the more notable European countries there. Protectionism has been a reaction of many countries, and UK's referendum that led to their exit, or leading to their exit of the European Union, is perhaps the most extreme example of some of the stances, political policy stances that nation states have taken to engage, to address this problem of refugees. Okay, so with those contextual factors in mind, what we'd like to do now is present the general results and then highlight just a couple of dynamics that we think are particularly important in explaining the general pattern that we're seeing for 2016, and then conclude with a few illustrations, as I mentioned, of 7 countries. So our general results, beginning with a visual depiction. The darker the color, the higher their government competitiveness score. You can see that Northern Europe, Australia, Canada, The United States ranking very well. When we break that down, in this particular slide, we can see how these countries have changed since 2015. We've taken the top 21 countries here just so that you can get a sense of the kind of movement that's happening. So the biggest movement we see is a city-state, Luxembourg jumping up in the rankings, the Netherlands and the United Kingdom both falling 6 spots, and Norway climbing from its 5th ranking in 2015 to number 1 in 2016. And generally, if you're looking at this, as I mentioned, we see some sort of geographic ordering as well, particularly if we're talking about the European countries, with northern and western countries faring better than the southern and eastern European countries. Some of the correlates here that we think are interesting. Common wisdom, perhaps, or common assumption at least, is that population leads to power. The idea of human capital should vault a country up in the rankings. However, what we see is a nuanced version of that certainly some population to achieve economy of scale is necessary to rank highly according to government competitiveness, but one that is stable and controlled. And so as you look at this inverse relationship between population and government competitiveness ranking, that certainly portrays that idea, that population is important within certain parameters. The higher countries on this, the y-axis on this is the government competitiveness score, and so the higher they are on the y-axis, the higher their score. And so you can see Norway there at the top highlighted. One caveat we'll note within that is that state-led democratic socialism, so the traditional Nordic Scandinavian model, with the exception of Norway, those countries have slipped just a little bit, and I think that's worth a little more investigation of what's going on there. Another general correlate that we want to point out is that the environment-friendly countries, especially those who have that commitment to reduce greenhouse gases by 2020, those countries are, perhaps not surprisingly, also ranking very well in government competitiveness. So there's certainly another case to be made here in having progressive environmental policies. So we'll go through just a few countries and highlight just a couple of anecdotes about each one as we go. We'll start with the country that took the #1 ranking in 2016 of Norway. You can get a nice visual depiction in the lower left-hand corner that they're pursuing fairly aggressively a broad variety of policy areas. They're not putting their focus on one particular area, but are really pursuing some strong, for example, educational, disaster management, economic policies, health and welfare continues to be very high for them. And that's driving, no doubt, their ranking. So they've got this nice, strong, balanced portfolio of policies that are improving the country and how the country's ranked. New Zealand came in at #4. Similar story with them. Slightly different foci. They're really putting some admirable effort into governance, and some evidence of this is their civil defense emergency management plan, where they're really clarifying some of the institutional leadership that's required. That's an important throughput for them. United Kingdom slips to 15, but still very highly ranked. They've struggled economically. The return has not been as quick for this country as others, but they continue to emphasize education and information and communications technology. So this is making a strong case for the United Kingdom to be ranked where they're at, which is highly ranked. Estonia, which is one of the nice examples that come from the Eastern European region of really pursuing aggressive environmental and information communications technology policies, and you can see that that's helped them overall in their rankings at number 16. South Korea continues to have very strong economic policies, progressive growth, and doing very well in information and communication technology as well, with lots of emphasis on institutional capacity in the country. Greece is a country that we've been, I think the world's been worried about for quite a while. They're ranked 28 in 2016 of the OECD countries. They've had the major bailout, so many iterations of a financial bailout. They continue to struggle with high unemployment rate as far as an environmental constraint. And they also happen to be geographically in an area where they're struggling with the social and political conflict that comes with refugees out of Syria in particular. At the same time, they continue to focus very well on some of their natural resources, their culture and tourism, and have a nice focus on health and welfare. Turkey, ranked at 34, has been a country that many have had a lot of hope and optimism about because of the case that it makes for Islamic democracy. Of course, there have been several setbacks to this in conflict, which leads to some instability. But food and agriculture, again, here, this is one of these where you can see a single policy area that really makes a strong case for a country to be ranked well, and also illustrates the potential that Turkey could have if they were able to facilitate a broader agenda of policies that they were pursuing. Thank you for your attention.